And we are live.
Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the free Assange online Vigil series number 6.0, hosted by myself, Taylor Hudak, Andrew Zygmunt, Christy Doff, and Steve Poikinen. So tonight we will be discussing the disclosures provided by Australian investigative journalist Mark Davis, and we credit Consortium News, CNLive, for allowing us to use the footage tonight. And in addition, we will also discuss the work of journalists David Lee and Luke Harding. And then later on this evening, we will also look into WikiLeaks releases, specifically the Afghan and Iraq war logs. So before we do get into this video, and we are going to show it to you all, I do want to read a quote. And this is a very powerful statement from Mark Davis at the conclusion of this video. He says, quote, "Julian was their fall guy. They printed a lie. These two high priests of journalistic integrity very happily colluded, reporting on something that hadn't happened. The entire searchable Afghan war logs interface was the sole creation of The Guardian. They promoted it on their website and in the paper, but they then turned around and said, we didn't publish this, Julian did. They set him up from the start. They should be in jail too," end quote. And we will play that video for you right now. And then we will again get into that, discuss exactly what it all means and unpack that for you guys. And then that will kind of naturally lead into our discussion about journalists David Lee and Luke Harding.
Everyone has an opinion on Julian. I certainly do. It gravitates around a couple of enduring slurs against Julian, that he's cavalier to the lives of people that were in his documents, and that he had a different level of professionalism than the true journalists did, that is, the Guardian journalists and the New York Times journalists, in 2010 when he first came to prominence. Well, I was there. I was there when he met them. I was there when they formed the bunker at The Guardian, where they all gathered. The Spiegel, The Guardian, New York Times, and Julian. I'd been travelling with him very hard.
So I'm going to go ahead and pause it. I just want to see what the chat says about the audio. Make sure everything's okay there. Okay, chat says it was great, so I'm going to keep it going.
Hard man to find. I found him and stuck to him like glue. And so when he went to the bunker, I was with him. And the reason they let me into the bunker was that he was an incredibly unreliable and unorthodox man. So this is pretty much it. This is life possessions, right? This is you.
This is not me. This is portable me.
His idea of starting work was midnight. Their idea was starting at 9 a.m. and going home at 5. And the job I did, which allowed The Guardian to let me into their fortress, was that I would go and find Julian. They thought I was part of WikiLeaks, I think. I would find Julian and I'd bring him to The Guardian at a reasonable compromise, maybe 2 in the afternoon. So they let me in. I was there every moment. Every moment that Julian was there, I was there. And every moment that those journalists have since re-narrated in their books, in their articles, in their Four Corners appearances, about the enormous integrity that they had and the lack of integrity that Julian had, I can say is a complete lie. And I am the witness to it.
Okay, we're paused on it.
All right, so I want to make clear the journalist that he's talking about, in case it's not, because that's David Lee from The Guardian, that's Luke Harding from The Guardian at that time. I can't remember who was attached to the New York Times, But then there were two other German guys who were attached to the Der Spiegel as well, that were all in part of this process. But when Mark Davis is talking here, he's specifically talking about David Lee and Luke Harding, and that's going to be that's going to be coming up.
So really, he's setting us up for what he's going to be presenting in the next few minutes, 15 minutes or so, on how he was involved with all of this, and then also what he can show as proof that what has been portrayed by the media, especially The Guardian and the New York Times, is not in fact what went down.
Exactly. And this is obviously, this speech was delivered last Thursday in Australia, I believe, and it was broadcast on CNLive. And this is the first time that this part of the story has really ever been put forth by Mark Davis. And the things that he does reveal are very telling and are very indicative of how much dislike and disdain there is for Julian Assange and for WikiLeaks within the journalistic community, and of course within the broader scope of the government and social institutions.
And let's not also forget that the New York Times has a reputation for not being great with their sources. So does Luke Harding specifically, but the Guardian as well. It was one of the reasons that Glenn Greenwald left when he was working for them. Like, it was for them to be in the same room as Julian Assange isn't by accident. And what resulted as of them being in the room with him, I would go as far as to say that it was part of a mission, a task, if you will.
And I hate to agree with that, but with these people being who they are and doing what they did, it's almost obvious. And I'm so glad that Mark laid this story out, because it's so important to get this out there, because it's something that most people don't remember. Because back in the day, like, there was no one that really even talked about this. So I think him coming forward is just such a big, almost boon to this right now, because of just everything else and all the disinformation that's going on right now.
So the interviews and the clips that he's showing were available, and actually I watched most of his. You could maybe call it like a mini documentary, probably about a year ago on Amazon. Right now, I haven't been able to find this footage again on Amazon. But so these interviews that he does with Julian, where he's following him around and going to the Guardian with him, or the bunker as he terms, were available to the public. But he gives so much more detail to what was actually happening, and I think even a little bit deeper insight to really these few weeks, few months he was with him, kind of as his shadow, basically following him through this process.
Yeah, this is and you can hit play here, but this is just, I mean, it is incredible footage. It's Mark Davis's personal archive that he went and dug through out of a reaction to the smear series that's going on Australian television that what's her name, Sally Neighbor is putting out. Yeah. And then you come to find out that, like, David Lee and Luke Harding are consultants. I don't know if on this particular one, I'm pretty sure that one of them was, but on other smear pieces, smearumentaries about Julian Assange.
Cool. So back into the video. Let me get it pulled back up.
So I'd like to just play a couple of very small clips. I won't bore you with long clips, but it'll just help you visualise the people that I'm talking about and the places I'm talking about. So this is a story I did in 2010, incredibly well known.
Is not flying entirely solo. For the first time in WikiLeaks history, he has pulled in some mainstream media heavyweights to collaborate in preparing material.
So where are we heading now? Off to the bunker in The Guardian.
And what's in the bunker? What's happening in the bunker?
In the bunker we have our team from Guardian, us, the Spiegel and New York Times.
So this is the bunker we're about to go. You often hear about it. They all refer to it when they're doing interviews.
Filled with computers, but at least it doesn't.
And it was here that they were taking what Julian had, which was impenetrable data.
Their way through the material.
They describe what they're doing during this 3-hour slaughter. Okay, and then there's like another 5 killed here and there, and 3 here. So now look at the exactly.
Just so you know, that's Nick Davies. That was Julian's main contact at The Guardian. Davies has made the most recurring and repetitive statement that Julian had this cavalier attitude to life. That's what I say. I was there for the impact of that material. The Guardian journalist, he narrates a dinner that they went to where Julian said, well, if they die, they die. Now that is the only event that I wasn't at. I remember the dinner, I didn't go to the dinner. But I can contradict every other account they talk about from that room where anyone expressed any concern whatsoever about the lives of people, except for Julian Assange. Except for Julian Assange. Now that has been such a stark contrast to what's been repeated that I just wanted to spend this time tonight dissecting that a little bit. I haven't done it before because it wasn't particularly relevant. Julian's been in custody on sexual assault charges. Now he's in custody on these, the espionage material relating to the documents that these guys are working on together. So now it's highly relevant and I do want to put it on the public record.
So it's suspicious. The other thing
for anyone to pull these 3 important organisations together, yeah, 3 competitors together, and us.
At some stage, they bring in this AC-130 gunship.
Up in the corner, David Lee wrote the most damning book about Julian. These guys, you might think.
Cool, and we're paused again.
Okay, so I want to bring just a point that, so Mark is speaking about this dinner that he was not at, where allegedly Julian says if they are a US informant, essentially they deserve to die. This smear has been used by the Guardian journalists and many documentaries about WikiLeaks. A lot of times people ask me which documentary or what should I watch, what movie should I watch about Julian and WikiLeaks? And I have a hard time making suggestions because typically what I have seen, and I haven't seen all of them, but on a lot of documentaries I've seen where they do interview anybody from The Guardian, is this dinner gets brought up over and over and over again. So this is a huge point that he's making, that in all the time and the hours that he spent with all of these journalists and with Julian Assange, Julian never expresses any sort of sentiment like this, but suddenly the one dinner he's not at, he says this awful thing. So I just want to bring attention to that because this dinner is quoted in many, many forms, whether it's been articles or documentaries and video footage about Julian.
Yeah, they were using it to paint him as a callous, uncaring person. And of course, he does go later on, Mark Davis goes on to say throughout the rest of the video too, that in fact, it was Julian who was expressing concern over these names potentially being brought forth to the public. Never once were these other journalists in the New York Times or with the New York Times and with the Guardian and Der Spiegel, never once were they really concerned about this. And another point to build off of that, this was quite a unique thing that happened too. We have 3 competitive news organizations that are working together Assange and his organization WikiLeaks were able to make that happen. I think that's kind of an incredible thing. Of course, it didn't end so well. And that's an understatement, to be honest, but three competitors were working together, and essentially they did throw him under the bus. And we do learn eventually too that there were meetings happening without Julian being present, and kind of some inner workings of trying to put all the blame onto him. But yeah, that's an interesting point. The one time that he wasn't there, he said this terrible thing. But truthfully, it was really these other people working for these outlets that had this kind of sentiment. So they kind of just shifted the blame. And it's remarkable about how many times this story has been recycled.
Well, it's really easy to project your own bullshit onto a target like Julian Assange, particularly if you've got the backing of MI5 and the CIA and every mainstream media outlet, multiple other governments. You're allowed this perverse freedom to uh just assassinate the character of this man. And you're right, it always happens when there's no one else around who could corroborate it or deny it. Like, it's just everybody on the same team and Julian Assange. And it um I think is as important as something like the uh, the Afghan War Diary and Collateral Murder is, and why news outlets should be wanting to report that. I'm less inclined to believe that the people in the room weren't sent there not necessarily by their immediate editors and their departments, but by U.S. and UK intelligence forces.
Absolutely. I mean, both of these papers that were present, the Guardian and the New York Times, they're some of the biggest propaganda papers. Like, they're papers that ride on a previous legacy of doing relatively okay reporting, and then have since just spun into propaganda outlets so rapidly, just like the Washington Post did. So I think it's something that, I mean, just for everyone to recognize that these people are propagandists. Like, they'll say and do anything to preserve and grow their power. So it's with all of everything, like with Julian not even being able to defend himself right now, I'd actually be interested to see what he said previously about this. And I don't know if there's any way we can really go back and look it up. But overall, I just think that it's one of the most disgusting things to literally smear someone who's a hero for this country.
I think watching this footage from Mark Davis in its entirety, and if we could find a link to it, we will definitely tweet that out. I've still been searching for where the full footage is now that Amazon has dropped it. It's very interesting because I think it paints Julian in a different picture. You get to actually see him as a person who is a caring journalist and not this monster that the Guardian and the New York Times has portrayed this experience with him as, and not this, you know, lofty person who comes and goes and doesn't do their work. Mark will talk a little bit later about how the dedication that Julian had put into working all night into these redactions. And yeah, I just thought when I had watched a lot of this footage well over a year ago, I just thought, wow, this paints a completely different person than these other documentaries, or for instance, like the movie The Fifth Estate tries to make him into this villainous creature that only cared about leaking the absolute leaks without any redactions and refused to hear anybody's words on it. So I really encourage people always to find interviews with Julian, listen to his words, and watch him, and then judge for yourself on his characteristics.
Yeah, I do want to make a point too that The Fifth Estate, that movie, part of it was based off of Daniel Domscheit-Berg's account of his experience with Julian Assange and working for WikiLeaks, but also it was partially based on the book that was written by Luke Harding and David Lee, yeah, which we'll get into later. But yeah, I think it's great that we do point out sources, like you said, Christy, where people could kind of see Julian for who he really is. In this footage that we're showing everybody, I think does a fine job of that.
Yeah, I think it's a good counter too to the Four Corners propaganda that's been coming out lately with all their documentary series or whatever they're doing over there. So I think this is a really, really important piece to keep highlighting and keep putting out there. Even like I'll put the link in for this video that we're using right now, but just continually sharing this because it's something that's so vital for people to hear and listen to because it counters that propaganda super, super well.
Can I make one quick point too about the journal that gets overlooked so many times? I feel like throughout this whole encounter that Assange had with the New York Times, Der Spiegel, and the Guardian, everybody's trying to determine, is Julian Assange a journalist? Is he not a journalist? In the United States, we do not have a licensure to be a journalist. Somebody who calls himself a journalist, they have no special protections under the First Amendment. So I think it's important to always remember that regardless of his status as a journalist or not, that means nothing with regard to his rights and his ability to publish information. So it's often something that we, hear a lot when we talk about WikiLeaks and the case, and of course it's relevant. However, our government makes no distinction with that, and I find that to be a good thing that we keep the government, or we have up until this point, out of our journalistic work.
So that's a fantastic point. And when people smear someone as not a real journalist, typically it's because they have that fancy Columbia journalism school degree, or Dartmouth or wherever, and with that comes the entitlement of knowing that they're better because they were got they got taught how not to question authority, how to toe the line and advance your career. And because you walk out of the Columbia School of Journalism with a wicked case of careerism instead of integrity, you're going to find a lot of people who smear the character of Julian Assange while trying to backpedal the charges against that would apply to them specifically, with in regards to publishing and reporting on these these leaks. So it's like almost like a form of classism, and I don't know if that's the right analogy, but it's certainly, I went to an elite school, I have this thing, therefore I am a real journalist because I tell you that Tulsi Gabbard hangs out with Modi and Assad and is fucking taking, a couple weeks off right now to go play around with her National Guard unit. I kind of, I'm done.
No.
Okay, are we ready to put the next clip on?
Yeah, I'll put it back up.
Okay, all right, cool.
Up on it. They were all over Julian, right? Julian had something valuable to them. They were fawning over Julian. None of this, oh yes, we're the professionals and we retained our distance. There was no distance, I can promise you, between them and Julian at this point. David Lee's also, ironically or tragically, the bloke that printed the password to the original files. So when he did his book, in a moment of boasting, in his book he put the password that opened the original files, all of them, that had been redacted actually. The Julian had physically redacted. This clown put the password up, printed it, and it was still active. It still worked. It still worked. That's what brought the full case of documents to the public eye, was him. So what they were doing in this room were taking the raw data, which I saw, you could see it on a computer, but it was very difficult to to read, to filter, to understand. A bit like reading an XLL sheet or something like that, like an accounting spreadsheet. The people that brought that material to life, gave birth to it, was the Guardian. WikiLeaks did none of that work. Julian didn't have the capacity to do the work. It was here with Guardian staff, those two journalists, I think 2, maybe 3 computer experts, they created the WikiLeaks database themselves. If Julian's in jail, they should be in jail. I mean, quite literally, they should be in jail. They created this, they put it up, they put it out to the world. So what they were doing were generating individual reference codes for every entry in the WikiLeaks material. They gave it a graphical interface, a look, and they made it searchable. That was the Guardian, or entirely the Guardian. Also in the room,
Be good. I mean, everyone has been generous and flexible.
it's the Spiegel.
You always want to sort by civilian casualties for this activity.
Are we still only with one? Sorry, I'm getting carried away.
And these are the techos coming in. So it's about a week of technical work. I mean, $100,000 probably to do the type of work they did. And the New York Times were coming in the week that I was there, were coming in regularly on the telephone. Between them, between these 3 groups, the Spiegel, Guardian, New York Times, they were fossicking through the material as the tech guys kind of gave birth to it, fossicking through, looking for stories that would be of interest to them. Of course, it was apparent that you'd be risking, if not the safety, certainly exposing the identity of many people. There's tens of thousands of documents there. Davies and David Lee. And Julian wasn't there. Julian hadn't arrived yet. I was there maybe an hour before. And it occurred to Nick Davies, as they pulled up an article that they were in fact going to put in the newspaper. He said, well, we can't name this guy, right? We can't name this guy, obviously, in the newspaper. And then someone said, well, he's going to be named on the website. Davies said some words to the effect, well, we'll really cop it then if we're blamed for putting that name up. And the words I remember very precisely from David Lee was he gazed across the room at they're going to create this, they're going to make it searchable, they're going to give it a graphic look, they're going to release it, they're then going to share the link to it and put 13 pages of newsprint dedicated to say, go and look at it. And they'll say, well, but we didn't publish it. Julian published it. Now, this was highly alarming to me, and I did raise it with Julian, who has, amongst his other qualities, he might be a genius, but he does have a certain naivety about him in reading people, in my view. He thought these guys were great. They were being nice to him. They were all absolutely, this was a collective effort. There's no idea that, he was the source and they were the journalists. If you watch this story, you'll get a better feel of that, right? They were all in it together. And Julian didn't quite believe that they'd be pushing him out onto the plank and then saying, oh, it's not us. We're just reporters. I mean, shameful, embarrassingly shameful. And so there's another scene I'd like to show you along those lines. This is about 4 days before the release of the Afghan war logs. And remember, Afghan war logs was really the public announcement of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. He wasn't very known prior to this. This is a conversation that's linked to what I was talking about before, from that comment of David Lee oh, but we're not publishing it. We can wash our hands of this, right? And how successfully they have done that. But this was a conversation. Julian relates to a lecturer at London University who was a very big supporter of Julian's. Gavin McPadden. Yep, this is Gavin McPadden's house.
As the new material starts to circulate between the three publications, the full scope of the data becomes clearer, and one of the partners seems to be getting a little nervous.
So the latest squabble is not over the date. They're all happy with that. They're fine. So that's right.
Yeah, exactly.
So they can claim that we didn't.
We just
weren't
were reporting
involved.
what was already there.
We were just reporting on what someone else did.
That's good. So who's going first?
The New York Times. I mean, wants a web startup press to scoop them. Wants to be scooped.
I mean, that's chilling to watch that now. Julian's in jail because of that subterfuge. Clearly discussed amongst themselves and not discussed with Julian. You can see his shock. What are you talking about? We're doing this together. This is a collective effort. What are you talking about? You want me to put it? You don't want to get it? I thought you'd be busting to get it, you know? And you can just see the way the honesty in which he narrates that story. That's why he's in prison today. That's why they're not in prison, why they should be. So, relaxed about it. It was Julian that brought it to a head. The release was to be on Monday morning. It was Thursday or Friday, I think it was Friday, where Julian said, well, we need to pull these names out. The names that are identified as informants. If it's going to endanger them, we need to pull them out. Now that called their bluff. Well, not that he was bluffing, but that absolutely threw them into a panic. It meant they wouldn't get their publication date. He asked for it to be delayed because they weren't going to assist in this task. He said, well, I'll do it with my people, but we need time. Now, because they were, as well as being allies, Guardian, New York Times, Der Spiegel, they were also competitors, bitter competitors, very unusual to be in the same room for them, and they didn't trust each other. So they couldn't agree that they thought there was a trick going on. They all got ready to print on Monday. No, we're going on Monday. So what happens, all these people that now write books about how concerned they all went home on Friday afternoon, back to Essex, back to Surrey, whatever. And Julian was left with not just the task, but the moral responsibility of trying to cleanse those documents in some way, and he did. All night. When I say all night, I mean from 5 p.m. till 9 a.m. the next day. We were sharing an apartment at the time. Julian removed 10,000 names by himself, not with the support team of The Guardian, etc., etc., etc. By himself, he removed them. Then it came to Sunday night. There's no particular scene to show you here, but I'm just showing to give you the flavour. This is the Frontline Club. Sunday night, the press conference is Monday morning. All the press editions are being printed and ready to be released. Now, this was my favourite moment, actually. So,
the information is now on the internet. 200,000 pages, mostly classified secret. It's the raw details of America's war in Afghanistan.
It will be the beginning of a media storm that will last for days.
Now, what really happened? They built this artifice that Julian was the man to walk the plank for them, and they'll report about a man falling off a plank, right? That was the premise. But WikiLeaks never released it that night. So WikiLeaks were meant to release on Sunday night. The Monday papers would report this event. He couldn't get it live. So all of this evening, it was expected to be up at about 9 p.m. It was meant to be live. It couldn't go up. And the panicked calls from the New York Times started coming, like hysterical calls. I could hear them, everyone could hear them. They're holding the presses, you know, hold the front page. Because it was saying this, you know, weird group WikiLeaks had released, you know, had published, had put online, trying to report a news event. It didn't go up. And their phone calls became more hysterical through the evening up until, I forget now the time difference, if it's important I'll try and become as precise as I can, up until about 2 a.m. they held the presses in New York and then just had to go. Now, and then the storm unfolded, and you'll see it here, a bit of it there, the storm unfolded. But they were essentially printing a lie. WikiLeaks didn't publish that night, and in fact didn't publish the next day. I think it was about 2 days. I don't know if that's ever known, but I think it was about 2 days before it got up. So these high priests of journalistic ethics were all of them very happily colluding in publishing a lie, that they were reporting something that in fact didn't happen, and they knew it hadn't happened, and they'd set Julian up from the start. I think it's important. I think that distinction is important when you see this recurring slur, this slander against Julian that started in 2010. He's cavalier with people's lives and he has no ethics. Started in 2010. I would have well and truly thought it would have washed away by now, but to see it on four corners again, 9 years later, in great detail, I feel compelled at least to address those issues. So I won't take any more time. I'm grateful to have done that. Thank you.
Cool. So one of the biggest things and one of the things that bothers me the most is the way that they pushed Julian into the front, and they made him almost unwillingly be the fall guy if he wanted this information to get released at all. And I think if you take that information that he talks about there in conjunction with everything that Julian was talking about in Cypherpunk, you get this really, really dark picture of how they were actually setting up what's happening right now through that process back then. So it's something that I think is really important to recognize, that these people plot a plan for decades and just wait for the moment to strike, wait till they can shift popular opinion for just a second to be able to step in and just essentially do whatever the heck they want while they have opinion in their favor. So I think fighting back against this is one of the most important things, because they've shown time and time again that they have the ability to at least manipulate public consent well enough to be able to do almost anything that they want. So knowing that all the way back then it was a setup to lead to where he's at today is disgusting to me.
Yeah, because they did not want to be the ones to publish it first, which is very unusual because, of course, we live in an era of speed-driven journalism where there's a lot of competition, and you want to be the first to put out certain publications. And Mark Davis was able to see that it was a huge red flag, that they wanted WikiLeaks to publish it first and then just kind of like reprint the story. But also, too, in the book that they publish, Luke Harding and David Lee, they kind of take a lot of these instances where they kind of put WikiLeaks decided not to, they wanted to delay the publication of these documents. And basically they changed the reason why. And they claim that WikiLeaks wanted to do this kind of just to cheat them, I guess, or just being irresponsible about it, when in reality they were being responsible about it and they were trying to protect people. In an article about this book, basically Nick Davies, who worked for The Guardian and worked alongside Julian Assange, said that he felt betrayed because they wanted to not publish this on that Monday and they wanted some more additional time. So yeah, I mean, this goes back since the start of this news organization, WikiLeaks. They've been attacked from all angles, and lies and distortions of the truth have been put forth about them and about their work.
Well, it's there's so many different highlights that in this what 20-minute clip. It's incredible. Um, David Lee making a point to say we're not publishing first. We're reporting on it, and having it come down to tech glitches on WikiLeaks end and not being able to go ahead and do it. Having WikiLeaks reported before the report came out. Like that's fucking incredible to me. Um and then of course, yeah, you've got all of the hit pieces that follow, and one of the characters that stays consistent throughout most of that is Luke Harding. Luke Harding got to where he was by working with David Lee. And then Nick Davies um he's just a fucking smear merchant. Like that's his function, his job, his role is to
Yeah, even if you just type his name, Nick Davies, into Google, like it's just propaganda piece after propaganda piece, and it's crazy. Like I never thought that anyone would actually go that hard and be paid that well to smear people, but it is incredible.
when you've already manufactured consent, all you need to do is manufacture confusion in order to keep the division going. And that's why you've got guys like Nick Davies, like David Lee, like Luke Harding. Luke Harding was the guy who reported the Paul Manafort visited Julian Assange at the Ecuadorian embassy, and then Luke Harding also reported on behalf of the new Ecuadorian president, like publishing. I think they found out they were fake documents.
Yeah, they never retracted that story. It's still up there. I actually printed it out today. It says at the top, though, that it's 8 months old. I don't know if they all of their articles say that, but I noticed that on here. I think it's interesting, too, that in the most surveilled building, probably, or one of the most surveilled rooms in the world, there's no footage of Paul Manafort ever being in that embassy. It's an embarrassment to
Or
Luke Harding
Russian.
for publishing this. It's amazing to me that he did not provide an apology for this, and that he did not retract the story, or at least update it and say that this is in fact not true, or provide some sort of explanation to it. He never did that. It's quite extraordinary.
That's flat out how you can tell he's playing for somebody's intelligence team. There are no repercussions for the smears that he's been able to get away with his entire career. David Lee, fucking, he made a career letting out a little bit of information about the UK's intelligence community. That's fucking controlled disinformation. Like that's what those guys do. They leave there's um oh god, just decades of research on it. But what intelligence communities do, what intelligence agencies do, is they feed their own stories into the press, and they put out whatever disinformation or just enough real information to get people to follow that narrative. They've used reporters from their onset.
And this might be a good time to bring up is that Luke Harding not only wrote this book on WikiLeaks with David Lee, but he's also responsible for, I think in the last couple of years, writing a book on the whole Russiagate scandal,
Yes.
or lack thereof.
Yes.
And so
Aaron Monte made him cry.
He continues to push the state propaganda and narrative. And he's built a career out of this, not only writing for The Guardian, but also publishing multiple books with smears and lies.
If you haven't seen that interview that Luke Harding did with The Real News when Aaron Mate was working there, go look that up at some point in the near future, because all Aaron does is go, do you have any evidence or proof to back up what you're saying in this book? The title of the book is Collusion. Where is the proof of the collusion? And Luke Harding gets so fucking twisted that he just jumps up and stomps off. Like, it's a thing of beauty. You ask the guy who wrote a book called Collusion to provide a little bit of evidence of the collusion, and he throws a hissy fit and stomps off.
Well, you're not supposed to question the narrative. You're supposed to just buy it. The neoliberals told you that 17
Why'd you
intelligence
walk into a
agencies
room
signed
with
off
their
on it.
latte? You know?
Right. I think it's hilarious, like the way that like all of this is aging for these people now, because it's all coming to light and getting pulled up now that we're put in this like almost extreme situation. So
Yeah,
it's pretty cool.
I feel like when you say intelligence agencies, or you say the intelligence community has confirmed this, or they're finding this, or they they all agree to a certain point. People hear that, and there's some sort of validity to it, and they believe it. And those who are pushing this know that, and I think that's what's really dangerous, and what makes so many of these false stories and like the Russiagate scandal so believable to so many people. The point is that you cannot trust the intelligence agencies. They are a puppet of our justice system. They are all intertwined. They all work together. Tim Canova went in depth about that last week on 5.0. So it's just a very dangerous time that we're in. And I want to make another good point too. Once CIA, always CIA. So I just wanted to make sure that I did make that point.
Yeah, I think that applies most specifically to the dude that's going around talking about aliens right now. That's a whole different topic for a whole different day. Um, but one of the things too is none of this is accidental and all of this is intentional. Um, it's them literally trying to just manipulate society, and I don't think people believe it anymore. But I think that people are so confused and just not even confused, but just don't care that they can get away with it. And that's what's giving them their power is not that people believe in the government and believe the lines anymore, but just that they're so fed up with it and don't think that there's anything that they can do.
So in like 81, William Casey, who was the director of the CIA at the time, said, we will know our disinformation campaign has succeeded when nothing the public believes is real. And you could argue that for the most part, they've succeeded beyond their wildest dreams in that. You're right to bring up apathy and or disillusionment. It doesn't take, I guess it takes a lot if you're really a Democrat or really a Republican to break yourself out of that party. But if you viewed politics as something that was largely bullshit to begin with, then yeah, that's going to make you less likely to vote or less likely to pay attention. But there's also people that need 2 or 3 jobs to survive, to make their basic needs met. And that's something like, well, I mean, you can't rent a place on minimum wage anywhere in the country now. Like the numbers of our increasing debt, um, or are increasing impoverished are going up. And this is today, like there was a big drop on the stock market, and I saw these neoliberal blue check assholes cheering about it. Like when that happens, when the economy bottoms out, the people that get hardest are the people at the bottom economically. Like they're the people that wind up out of work, missing meals, have a 401k or a pension gone. And these same people that would slander Julian Assange to promote their own self-serving interest or at least self-preservation are the same people that are like cheering for the economy to tank just because Trump is the president right now.
That's like Bill Maher. He said that he hopes for a recession. While he lives on his millionaire estate, he makes tons of money, so out of touch, but hopes for a recession just because he dislikes Trump. Instead of really going out there and doing something to maybe elect a different president, he hopes for the detriment of those who will, the common person.
Bill Maher had George Carlin on his show. And then he turned around and wrote $1 million check to Barack Obama. Like the guy who told us about the big club was on his show, and he said, all right. Like, he was always kind of a douchebag. There's a hilarious original Politically Incorrect with Bill Maher with Boots Riley from The Coup on it. And it's wild, dude, because there's four smarmy white guys just ganging up on the kid with the afro who wanted to talk about socialism. It's wild. At any rate, Bill Maher is one of those guys whose money depends on him misunderstanding the situation or not getting it right or advocating the wrong thing. HBO pays that guy a lot of cash to intentionally get it wrong and be like, here's two right wingers and Fran Lebowitz. And
Yeah,
we're
and
going to talk about, how things really are.
end of the day, he's a millionaire funded by billionaires. Like, he's someone that gets his power from doing what the people above him want him to do. Because the moment he changes that tune and the moment he doesn't walk the line, he doesn't have a show anymore. He's not a millionaire anymore. They can just strip bank accounts and assets. They can freeze stuff. So it's, if he doesn't play the game and walk the line, which I don't think he should, but that costs him everything that he's comfortable with. So when he calls
Not
for a recession, all it's doing is him thinking that's the only possible way to get Trump out of the White House. And it's because he doesn't care about what actually happens to people. He cares about how much money he has and if his neoliberal friends get into power.
And isn't that walking away from what the Democratic Party was always supposed to be about, was for the working person and the everyday average person? And now we have these big celebrity Democrats that don't care about those people. They
well,
aren't the party of the people anymore.
No,
And that
there
was
is no
something,
party of the people anymore, I don't think. I think they all work for the same people. They're all funded by the same, giant corporations. So that is a great point you bring up. There really is, I mean, there are a few candidates who I think stand out and really do want to make a difference for the common person. However, at the same time, at the end of the day, they are all politicians. We have to be wary, of what they say is potentially just to please us and just because they know that's what we want to hear.
So let's
yeah.
talk about this for a second, because this is an important thing to remember, especially because it's something that you can kind of tie to free speech and freedom of the press. There's a reason. Not only, I mean, the Democrats have always been corrupt as fuck, but there's a reason specifically that they moved away from labor. And the reason they moved away from labor and kept around the super corrupt and super corruptible union bosses um, was because of communism. In the 1940s, there was still a really strong union structure, but the Red Scare and the McCarthy hearings and all of that shit stamped out the left. So Democrats had to pander to business anyway. They were also pandering to far right religious figures behind closed doors, and they were you see all kinds of right wing legislation supported by Democrats at that time, and moving forward as well. But the decline of unions began with the Red Scare at the end of World War II.
And just since we're on the topic, to talk about how bad it is for unions right now, I have a buddy who's trying to do some union organizing that's issue based out here where I'm from in this part of Ohio. And he literally has to go to the political director, get approval from the political director to begin organizing the union. And then once he has the political director's approval, he has to go talk to the head of business development to make sure that the issues that they're talking about and what they're actually fighting for don't interfere with any of their financial interests that the union has. So the modern union, the way that it works, at least in the service industry, has turned more into a large corporation that just controls and sets prices than an actual, like, looking out for the workers union. And
What
it's
union
actually,
management essentially does is they negotiate with the workers on behalf of management more often than not. There are a few good unions out there. If you're a member of one, fucking solidarity, like, um, but there are really shitty union bosses nationally. And from about the mid 50s on, they began negotiating with management or on behalf of management to the workers. And that's why you've got something like what less than like 10.1% union membership nationwide now, like
Mhm.
total.
And something interesting too that I found out today doing some research for my court case was that one of the first times that free speech was taken to the Supreme Court was in 1919 against Eugene Debs for organizing people to reach out to the communities to stop them from enlisting in the military and to get into World War One. And in case anyone doesn't know, Eugene Debs was like one of the original badass union organizers. Like he was literally just speaking. He was so dangerous that they locked him up in jail for almost the entire duration of World War One just to stop him from having any type of platform. And he was one of the first people charged under the Espionage Act as well.
Yeah, his
If I,
case is often used in precedent for many other cases, so I'm not surprised that it came up in yours. And also to everybody watching too, we will at the conclusion of tonight's visual, we will Andrew will recap with an update of what happened today, and we'll provide a brief background on what happened and why he was in court. But before we do that, we do want to kind of start a new segment here on our vigils. And basically that's where we kind of look at the various leaks that WikiLeaks has published over the years and kind of discuss them, really dive into their meaning and perhaps relate them to what's going on today to kind of provide some relevance, because we think that obviously WikiLeaks has provided us with so much knowledge, and we think that by looking at it, it could really help us understand much of what is going on today. So I'm going to hand this over to Christy Doff, and she's going to kind of dive into and touch on the key points of the Afghan and Iraq war logs. Christy.
So yeah, I've been seeing in chat, people often talk about what a resource WikiLeaks is and the ability to type in just about any topic or country or politician and find documents on them. So while 2010 was not that long ago, a lot of people are not familiar with what was in the Afghan war diaries and the Iraq war logs. So I just wanted to kind of go over some high points, some numbers, and some of the key topics that were actually in these leaks. They are quite extensive as far as numbers go. So Afghan war diaries, 91,000 reports spanning from 2004 to 2010. These included things like lethal military actions involving the US Army. The details in these drops included the numbers of persons killed, wounded, detained, the geographical location, military units involved, major weapon systems. These reports were intercepted, radioed in by soldiers and intel officers. They also included bits and pieces about Marine intelligence, US embassies, and different corruption reports and developing activity across Afghanistan. When WikiLeaks published this, they stated, "We hope its release will lead to a comprehensive understanding of the war in Afghanistan and provide the raw ingredients necessary to change its course." So just to give you a little bit of comparison, the Afghan war diaries was in July of 2010, and in October of 2010, the Iraq war logs came out. We're looking at an increase of reports here. There was almost 400,000 reports, so a little over 390,000. These spanned from January 1st, 2004 to December 31st, 2009. There was a couple of months that weren't included in there. And these were from US Army soldiers. And the reports detailed here was on 109,000 deaths. 60% of those were civilians. A little over 23,000 were enemy or insurgents. 15,000 were host nation or Iraqi government forces. 3,700 were coalition forces or friendly deaths. So when you break it down, 31 civilians died every day for 6 years in Iraq. And when you compare these two, the Afghan leaks had 20,000 deaths in the reports. The Iraq leaks, 5 times more lethal with an equivalent population size. So really you can dive very deep and look at all these individual reports, and there are thousands, like I said. But I just wanted to give you guys some of the high numbers and the high points of what these leaks entailed. A lot of people have heard of them, but they don't know what's really in them. And then just pass it on to you guys as or as if you want to talk about what you experienced when you first heard about it, maybe your thoughts as you learned more about these leaks, and just over the years, how these leaks have impacted you.
So personally, these leaks were some of the first things that actually like shocked me about what was going on in our government. In 2010, I was a year out of high school, I want to say. I've talked about it before, but I just had a different perspective of the world back then. But sitting there and actually watching the videos and reading the emails and all that kind of stuff, it just made it seem, I don't know, like so much more real. Like being able to see, not in real time, but just what my government was actually doing in my name just really helped to change my perspective on like what I thought about the war in Afghanistan and what I thought about the war in Iraq. Because pre 2010, like pre these leaks, I was a very, very big supporter of that war. Like as terrible as that is to say, but WikiLeaks was one of the things that really like shook me awake about the reality of what was going on there. And then that led me later to like find Ron Paul and all these other just principled anti-war actors and voices that are out there right now. Um, but the big thing I want to say with these leaks is we're still in the wars. Like the war in Iraq hasn't ended, the war in Afghanistan hasn't ended. We've only escalated. We destroyed Libya, Honduras, um, Nicaragua, I think, was another country that we had our troops die in, like literally just for almost no reason. So there's countries that we haven't left Iraq and Afghanistan and have only escalated further to the point that we're now trying to circle back and get Iran, which was what the whole neoconservative plan was to begin with. So I think that's really important to call out too.
You're absolutely right. What it the war in Afghanistan is old enough to join the army and fight in the war in Afghanistan. The war in Iraq is old enough to get at least a driver's license or a learner's permit, if not a driver's license. Like, there are now kids, I saw this like a year or two ago, who were, 4 or 5 when their dad went to Afghanistan on his first tour, on their first tour, on their first invasion. And then their kid got old enough to join the military and went and like was hanging out with his dad in the military because that war is still going on in the same country. It's insane.
This is
Go ahead.
Oh no, sorry, go ahead.
When this drop happened and then a few months later the Iraq war logs dropped happened, one of the things that I did was read the threat reports and see, or so, cruise through the threat reports, because this just shows you the level of complete and total occupation that took place and is taking place by the US military. Like, they're hemming up a kid for stealing a bike in his own neighborhood. US soldiers,
Yeah, it's the global military. We as a nation have accepted the idea that other countries don't need police forces. We've accepted, not don't need, but that will supplement them. We've accepted the fact that most countries in the world now, coming out of World War II, rely on us for their military. And that's what the big push to try to get the people in NATO to spend more money was, is our country's going bankrupt. Like, it's something that Ron Paul talks about all the time. We're $21 trillion in debt publicly. There's been released reports that say we're another $21 trillion just missing, like unaccounted for expenditures out of the Pentagon. And so these wars have bankrupted our country. Like, we've let them go. Like, we as people, as the citizens of the United States, have allowed these wars to go on regardless of who was elected.
Right. And I think the whole point, of course, of learning this information from WikiLeaks is to, stand up and do something about this and actually act to ensure that, these wars do end and that we don't repeat ourselves and continually become engaged in these wars. like Andrew, well, I'm younger than Andrew, but like Andrew, I was like a teenager when these first came out. So unfortunately, I was not able to fully appreciate the full scope of what was released. But I remember it was when I learned about this, when they were dropped, it was, even though I kind of knew that the United States was, of course, not a benevolent force throughout the world, I thought we were, for the most part, acting in goodwill, which is extremely naive, extremely. And then at that point, after learning all of this information and being confronted with these facts, I learned that largely the majority of what we're doing is malevolent, and it's out of greed, really. And I think that it's important to be confronted with this information. But again, too, the whole point of this vigil is also to promote activism. So I think that while we do have this information and that we are aware of it, it's important that we do things to further spread the knowledge, and also to actually do something ourselves, because those at the top are not going to do anything to fix this, because it's not in their interest to do so. It's not in the media's interest either, because they get great ratings when there's war. There's something that people always have to tune in to kind of see what's going on, and it's sensational. So there's always a constant need for war from those at the top. So I think that when we're presented with this information, WikiLeaks has done its job, and all of its staff members, and Julian Assange. Now it's on us to do ours, not only to promote for his well-being and for his eventual release from prison and for his freedom, as well as Chelsea Manning, but also to end the corruption that they have fought so hard for us to be aware of. I think there's a unique responsibility that we all have. I'm curious as to what you guys think of that, because again, I know that that is a big part of why we're doing this, is to promote activism.
Well, I think that people should attempt to read WikiLeaks like any other publication, like any other paper, like any other outlet, and just kind of read through, as much of a drop as you can, and absorb that information, and then remember that the next time somebody says something negative about Julian Assange, like, look, we know what we know now because we have this guy. And I think if you can expose yourself to the information in the drops, and it's something that, like, we're going to do as a part of the Vigil series as well, so we'll be learning together. I think if you can do that, the more informed you are, the better armed you are, and the better armed you are, the more willing you're going to be to take us armed with information, boys and girls. Armed with information, the more willing you're going to be be confident to speak out about it, or engage in activism to take a stand for it, and represent it. So I think, like, the people who have dedicated their lives to activism are buried in books or research or reporting while not being activists, and you have to constantly be aware of new information, but you have to retain old information. And what the Afghan war diary and the Iraq war logs proved was the goddamn hippies were right, the goddamn punk rock kids were right, the US military is out there torturing people and killing people and for sport, and we knew it, and we told you about it, and you pushed us off into this corner. And that's what they had to do with WikiLeaks too. They had to make it about the man. They had to single him out, as Mark Davis said, make him the fall guy, make him the villain.
So I can't find the exact quote, but Julian had a quote that talks about how every time an injustice happens and you don't act, you train yourself over and over and over again to just completely ignore the fact that injustices are happening in the world. And so I think that's a big thing that WikiLeaks was trying to do, is reverse that progression, to where instead of people seeing something wrong in the world and just sitting by passively, they were trying to get people actually engaged and getting out to talk about these things, to give people these conversations that break the mainstream media narrative. Because even after 2010, we had a troop surge in Iraq and Afghanistan. Like, we put thousands more people in them after all this came out, because that was supposed to be the way that we end the war. The only way you end a war is bringing troops home. You can't put more people in a country and expect the war to come to an end. So I really think it's important that we begin to train ourselves to actually act in the face of injustice. And it's not just when the news story pops that gets us all like really angry or really sad or really some other emotion about what's going on. It's acting in the times where it's not in the headlines, and it's creating the conversations with people when it's not in the headlines that are going to make the biggest difference and be the way that we can actually send Julian home.
I think it's very interesting. The four of us are, a little bit different ages, but all about the same generation. We grew up after 9/11, and really, a part of our teenage and adult life has been absorbed in this war propaganda. I mean, most of our life, there was a graph going around Twitter that based off what year you were born, how much time has the US been in a war? For me, it was over half, but it's felt a lot longer since I was in high school when 9/11 happened. And then growing up through that and being consumed with the war propaganda and we're the good guys, we're freeing all these people. Freedom isn't free. And then to have this explosion of information showing that no, we're not the good guys over there. We're doing awful things over there. And we're doing awful things to innocent people, not just, oh, the bad guys, they deserved it. So it's a really interesting time for our generation, I think, to be pushing against the narrative and refusing to buy into the war propaganda that our parents and our grandparents maybe were exposed to as well in their generations, through the Vietnam War, other wars, the first war in Iraq in the 80s, early 90s, and really kind of fighting back through our activism that no, we want the information and we want the truth, and we are not going to continue this path anymore.
I was in the 5th grade when 9/11 happened. I remember the teachers kind of not knowing what to do anywhere. We weren't allowed to go out to recess that day. No one went to classes. It was just really just overly bizarre. And then I fell for the
you when 9/11 happened.
I was a senior in high school.
I was in 2nd grade, I think. 2nd or 3rd grade. They didn't tell us at school. It was weird.
We watched it all day long. We watched it all day long, and we all wanted to go home and we're terrified.
Yeah. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to be an adult on that day, the panic that must have ensued at that time. But yeah, I mean, we're all, of course, in the same generation and have been experiencing war for at least the majority, at least half of our lives. We've been experiencing this, and it's sold to us as a good thing. And if you disagree, that's now considered terrorism or a form of terrorism.
It'll get you on a list. What's interesting about that how long have you been at war in your life, is that they don't include coups or proxy wars. They don't include the Cold War.
Yeah, I was wondering about what they were. It didn't really say what they included and counted on that.
The Cold War resulted in how many proxy wars? I mean, so the graph is a little bit, it was there to prove a point, but I think overall it was a little disingenuous, especially from the creation of the OSS onward. But I remember the Cold War propaganda in the 80s. I remember a fair amount of the Reagan administration, the first H.W. Bush 8 years. And I was 14 when we went to war in Iraq the first time. I remember it on the front page of the paper and giant red letters, war, and oh my God, dude, I was they're gonna fucking slaughter some people. Like, it was in the paper, like, we're gonna go get them. It was you couldn't criticize the military then either. Like, you really couldn't. But what Barack Obama was especially good at was putting the anti-war left and like a lot of other people who were coming up in college who just flat out didn't have the experience of going out to a fucking anti-war protest, because Obama put those motherfuckers to sleep. And now they're all the fucking resistance. I don't know.
So, hey D2U in chat, Hayes D2U. I'm assuming that means something that I just don't understand. Actually threw that quote in there that says, every time we witness injustice and do not act, we train our character to be passive in its presence and thereby eventually lose all ability to defend ourselves and those we love. In a modern economy, it's impossible to seal oneself off from injustice. That's the quote that I was thinking of. And that's, I mean, that couldn't be more true. Like, that's what all this is. Like, that's what my court case is. That's what Chelsea Manning's doing. That's what Julian's doing. We're all, like, that's what this stream is, and everyone who's watching it. We're all just trying to find a way to act against this tyranny that's facing us.
Yeah. So Andrew, do you want to maybe get into a little bit about your court case? I think we're going to be touching on this, frequently as more, dates come up, to kind of let everybody know what's going on, because I know the Courage Foundation is now, helping out. I was with you on that day that happened, but I want you to, it was very strange and quite the overreaction from the police. But I think that you do deserve credit, because you clearly, showed a lot of courage in that moment. And I think you're handling it really well now. And I think you're very brave also for continuing to go ahead with this. Most people would have just paid the fine and been done with it, but you're going to continue to move forward with it. Can you explain maybe why you're doing that, and give people who don't know the details some background information as to what happened that day and where you're at right now?
Yeah, so I don't want to give the full context, because the story goes back before, like, the posters started with my history with the court. But
Andrew's got priors.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like $4,500 of priors with this court. But so the short version, just to get everybody caught up on why that stream popped up randomly today on Periscope, Twitch, and on my Facebook page. Back in mid-August, back in mid-July or mid-June, I think, leading up to the 4th of July, so early June or late June, early July, Taylor and I were out in the city of Overland putting up signs. And we're walking down the street, we put signs up, the officer yells, "Hey, don't do that." And so I just finished stapling the sign on there. She flashes sirens, pulls over. Long story short, I got cited for advertising on public property. Apparently putting signs up that say "No more torture, free Julian Assange, journalism isn't criminal," things like that are considered advertising within the city of Oberlin. I went to the city council meeting a couple days later. This was, I want to say the city council meeting was on the 2nd of July, and then, or maybe the 1st, and then what have you. But anyways, long story short, the city councilman basically said, "Hey, we're going to go through court. We're not going to talk about this." My microphone, actually, I don't know if it was cut or not turned on, but I wasn't picked up on the audio while I was talking for the opening statements about what happened. But the city council was, and the people after me were picked up on the audio. And right after I sat down, the female officer, who I won't refer to her inappropriately, but there's some words I could use there. The wonderful female officer walked into the city council meeting and actually said that your camera's not, or your microphone wasn't on. Gives like this cynical smile and walks away. So after it, I was a little frustrated. The city council was basically like, "Yeah, no, there's nothing we can do. You're basically just going to have to do your day in court and suffer the consequences." So directly after the city council meeting, I go and put up some more signs. The first officer was cool. Like, I just literally wanted to, I don't know, like, spark a conversation with these officers so that way they could understand why I was doing it, more than just going to the city council meeting and talking about it, because Oberlin's a very tight-knit community. long story short, first officer, super cool, pulled the posters down that I put up, but talked to me for about 10 minutes. And as I was going to leave, that wonderful woman and her friend Sergeant Strongjaw decided to roll up and had just a lot of problems. So he said, "Hey, you got to go, blah blah blah." So me just being me, I go, I put the signs up again, I get cited. I actually hand the officer the ticket to get the ordinance number off of the first one from when I got cited the week prior. Um, Long story short, fast forward to today, it was my pre-trial. And essentially what the lady told me is, this isn't important. Like, this isn't something that I want to deal with. It's not something that I even want to go to trial. Give us $100 plus court costs. We'll drop one of the charges and you're free to go. And I told them no. I explained to her the differences between advertising, which is commercial speech, and political speech, which is advocating against the actions of the government and not the actions of an individual or entity. So my court date is now set for, hold on, let me look at my calendar. Couple Wednesdays from now, September 18th. So I have to figure out what I'm going to do with that, because I haven't heard from the ACLU of Ohio yet, but I'm trying to get in contact with them, and the Courage Foundation is helping me out there. So I think it's really important just to kind of keep an eye on this and see where it goes, because it could, if I'm found guilty of it, I'm going to appeal to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and see if I can get this put into an actual Supreme Court case to make it something much bigger than it is.
Well, we obviously wish you luck with that. And, it is kind of, it's expensive, and it's a hassle to kind of go through this process, but I know that you're doing it for a greater cause, and to kind of also get our message to free Julian Assange and free Chelsea Manning, to kind of get that into the public sphere. We're not quite sure that that's why we don't think that they read the message, and that's why they wanted us to take them down. On a side note, though, that officer did have to go and take down all of our signs that we had put up. She asked us if we would take them down, and we said no, we didn't want to. So she ended up having to do that. Are there any last thoughts before we close out? Because I have to make a shout out to Free Assange Denver. They have an event coming up, and I want to kind of explain a little bit about that. For those in the Denver area, if they want to participate and meet like-minded people in their area. Any last thoughts, ideas, anything?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate again this week, and Taylor's probably speaking to this as well. On August 24th is another day of action that many cities are participating in. Right now, the list is Stratford, which is East London, is our main event happening that day. But in solidarity, we have Dusseldorf, Germany, San Francisco, Denver, Concord, New Hampshire has just announced that they are going to do events. So I'm sure there'll be a few more cities joining. But if you are looking for a date coming up this month to do something for Chelsea or Julian, August 24th is going to be, I think, a really popular day for rallies and events.
Before we wrap up here, actually, could I get Steve to talk a little bit about what's going on with William Barr and the issues facing encryption and everything right now? Because you did a really, really good piece over it on Slow News Day. But if you could give us a little, just like a 2-minute brief about what's going on with that, and then I'll follow up with the encryption plug.
Sure. A few weeks ago, Attorney General Barr, who is a former CIA agent who tried to stonewall the Pentagon Papers, who came up with the incubator baby story that got America on the side of the Iraq War, who pardoned Iran-Contra war criminals, that guy. He was giving a speech, and he laid out his vision to make it so that the government is allowed backdoor access to any and all encrypted products, essentially making them ostensibly worthless if you're going to use it to plan an action that you don't want everyone to know about until you do the action, or if you have like a really super secret grocery list or something like that. Like, you should be able to have end user to end user encryption software. While this is going on, there's a nod to Facebook, who already built this backdoor encryption into Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp. So if you are an activist that is using WhatsApp, please stop, because nothing about your service is encrypted. William Barr, and this is backed by every federal and state and local law enforcement agency. He wants these tools to be available to them. There's a push in cities to ban facial recognition. There's a big deal going on with Amazon and their Ring doorbell camera service. And it's a really important time for both internet freedom and the ability to communicate on encrypted software. And more people need to be aware of it. There's a great piece in Mint Press News from I think last week or the week before, by Whitney Webb. And I highly recommend everybody go read that. We're quite literally like facing shit that Orwell couldn't come up with in terms of mass surveillance and government overreach. And this is a conversation that you can have with pretty much anyone right now about, hey, do you think the government has the right to do this? Most people are going to say no. The small government conservative types or more right-wing libertarian types should recognize it as a huge government overreach, a huge government intrusion, and something that they are fundamentally opposed to. And if you know any of them, your blue no matter who friends should be opposed to it, because it's fucking Bill Barr. Like, it's a win-win.
And the whole thing with encryption too is what it does is it allows you to not be picked up in the dragnets of mass surveillance. So when you encrypt an email or you encrypt a text message, there's apps you can use. The ones that I personally think are okay right now, Signal and Wire for messaging and calls. And Signal, I don't know about Wire, but Signal has a video chat service that you can use with it as well. The Tor browser as well as Orbot are great for phones and computers. They're device anonymizers. Orbot more specifically anonymizes app traffic, and 90% of apps won't be affected by it. Tor is an anonymous browser. It's essentially a VPN service that you can use. And then Proton Mail is an anonymous email service. So what I mean by not getting picked up in mass surveillance dragnets is with access points at the wires, the NSA can collect any and all information that gets taken across the internet. They team up with big tech companies and all these kinds of things to just get your information and process it through algorithms to determine specific things like likelihood to cause dissidents, the ability to have predictive programs to counter protests that are coming up, things like that. So what encryption does is allow you to not get swept up in all of that. So when they run these algorithms across what the NSA actually has in their database, your conversations don't get pulled into that and you don't get put into these algorithms. If they want to target you and find out what you're doing, they have to get to you specifically. They have to actually get on your device to be able to notice what you're doing. And it's something they can do. It's something that the Volt 7 release has revealed to the world, is that they can literally pretty much have the toolkit to get into anything, anytime, anywhere. So it's important to protect yourself as much as possible, because if they have to spend half an hour worth of work to get into your phone to see that you're sending cat memes, grocery lists, and I love yous through an encrypted messaging app, that's a half hour they're not spending on the people doing heavy lifting, and like the higher end journalists and the legal work and all of that stuff. So if you can encrypt your device and they have some reason to think that you're an activist, they can try to hack into it. But at the end of the day, that just wastes time and essentially creates this cat and mouse game where if there's enough people with encrypted technologies, and I'm sure it'll evolve and change as they roll out these softwares that say, hey, you can't do this. There'll be new softwares that get made that don't have that backdoor in it that may not be downloadable off the App Store, but you can get from third-party websites and things like that. So that's something to keep in mind too. But overall, use what we can right now so that way we can organize most effectively. like with the protests and everything coming up on the 23rd and 24th, get your buddies to download Signal. Just it works the same as a text messaging app. You just have to make it your default text app when you open it, and it asks you to do that, and it automatically sends encrypted messages. So download that and just start talking to your buddies about what you guys can do just with you and them on the 23rd or 24th. Another big date to keep in mind too is October 11th. We don't have anything specific set up yet. There is a protest in DC for Extinction Rebellion on October 7th, just so everyone can kind of have that in mind. But with October 11th, that is the 6-month anniversary of Julian getting pulled out of the embassy. So just hold that date the best you can, get it off work if you can. I believe it is a Friday night. So we'll try to get we will get something set up on that day as far as like an organized global protest. But yeah.
Yeah, and the weekend before, it looked like October 4th, I think, that will be the 13th anniversary of WikiLeaks as an organization. So if the 11th doesn't work for you, the weekend before is also a really good time to celebrate all the work and achievements of WikiLeaks.
Okay, yeah, so we do have a lot of important dates coming up. One that I do want to mention, and this is just because this one in particular, because Andrew and I did this. We went to the Jimmy Dore show and we talked to people there, and the Denver Free Assange people, they're also taking on that initiative as well. And I met them. They're wonderful, awesome people. When I was in Denver, I was working on a project unrelated to any of this, and I met up with them, and they're great and they're enthusiastic, and we had really great discussions. So if you are into these vigils, if you care about this message, I encourage you, if you're in the Denver area, to please go out and reach out to them. They are going to be Saturday, August 24th, they are going to be at Raleigh State Capitol from 1 to 3 p.m. And then that evening on August 24th, Jimmy Dore is going to have a show there. I'm not exactly sure where that's at, but it is on their website. From 6 to 8 p.m., they're going to be handing out flyers and doing some outreach prior to the show. Also, when I was there, I gave them ActionForAssange wristbands. So they will be handing them out to you guys if you want them. Again, we are still working on a way to kind of get them distributed to people easily. We're still working on that. We're not 100% sure how to do so. But again, if you do want one of these, the Denver people, they do have them. And you can follow them on Twitter at DNVFreeJA. So we'll be posting about these dates as they approach not only this Denver event, but also the many other ones throughout the world to make sure that you guys know when events are going on around your hometowns. So again, I think we're going to close out for the evening unless anybody else has some final thoughts. But again, thank you guys so much for tuning in and watching these vigils. Next week, we are going to have some guests on our vigil. And please, if you have any suggestions for us or things that you want us to talk about or see, do let us know, because we're receptive to that. And we want, you guys to enjoy, our content and to, want to come back and, communicate with us. And we want your input, and we're open and receptive to hearing that. So you can find us. We'll go around the panel of where you can find all of us. Steve, I'll start with you.
Okay, you can find me on the tweeters at Slow News Day Show. If you're just seeing me for the first time, I also host a show called Slow News Day. You can find that on YouTube at YouTube.com/Slow News Day Podcast. Yeah, there's a corresponding Facebook page for that. Please check out the show. I interview some just legendary and amazing people. Hopefully there will be some more crossover between people that I've had on the show and people that come on this show. Yeah, that's about that. Much love, everyone.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Andrew Zigman. That's pretty much the only place to find me. You can find Action for Assange at action4assange.com, and also action_for Assange on Twitter. We are getting access to the Action for Assange page. That just hasn't been finalized yet. So that's something that we're working on here into the future.
You can find me at ChristyMKD84 on Twitter, and also follow over at Unity number 4 letter J, Unity4J on Twitter as well. We are constantly promoting different events around the world and different ways you can be active and involved, write your representatives, all sorts of different things you can do for Julian and Chelsea over there.
And I'm Taylor. You can find me on Twitter at TaylorM_Hudak. And also you could find Action for Assange on Twitter, like Andrew said, at Action_for Assange or at Action for Assange. And again, that's the number 4. Also remember to like the videos if you like them, and subscribe as well. Again, please feel free to reach out to us throughout the week with your thoughts. We really appreciate that. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see you next week.